Hey guys, what's up? Hoje é dia 21 de maio de 2016. Vou mostrar para vocês aqui a nossa pre-trip inspection. Temos que fazer isso toda vez antes das viagens e aqui a gente vai ter que fazer para poder também passar na avaliação. Esse é o mestre Cris, que vai ser responsável pela pre-trip de hoje.
Okay,
Go ahead, my man.
Here's a pre-trip live from U.S. Truck Driving Training School from Sterling Heights, Michigan. As you enter the truck, before you pop the hood, you're going to look underneath the truck for any signs of puddles, for anything that might be leaking, such as oil, power steering fluid, coolant fluid. No puddles. You pop the hood. You come over to the side of the engine where the oil dipstick is. Make sure the oil is above the refill mark and that it is not leaking, it's not cracked or bent or damaged, and that it is properly secured. During your test examination day, all you have to do is point. You do not have to check it. Being that we're going to use the vehicle, we are going to check the oil. If you were to have to add oil to the vehicle, this is the reservoir that the oil actually goes into to put oil into the vehicle. Okay, now going over to the alternator belts. The belts cannot be more than 3/4 inch play from center. They can't be cracked, frayed, glazed, or worn, and they have to be properly secured. The alternator itself cannot have any missing parts, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, and also has to be properly secured. Then you're going to check all the electrical connectors, making sure there's no missing parts and that there's no exposed wiring and the wires are not frayed and they are also properly secured. Then you're going to check your water pump. It's holding coolant fluid. So the key word to that would be it's not leaking, it has no missing parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and also it is properly secured to the engine. You check all your hoses, making sure all your hoses are properly coupled, secured, not leaking. The hoses themselves are not cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and that the hoses are properly secured. You have your windshield wiper blade fluid, making sure that that reservoir is full and that is not cracked or damaged and it is properly secured, and the key word, it is not leaking. Then you check out your frame of the vehicle, made of metal, making sure that it's not cracked, bent, shifted, no shiny exposed metal, no missing parts, and that it is properly secured. Then we're going to go to the front suspension of the front end, looking at the front mount, the center U-bolt mount, and the rear mount. Made of metal, cannot have no missing parts, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, and has to be properly secured at the top and at the bottom. Center U-bolt mount, made of metal, cannot have any missing parts, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, and has to be properly secured. The rear mount, same as the front mount. No missing parts, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, and has to be properly secured at the top and at the bottom. The leaf springs themselves, they cannot be cracked, bent, shifted, or missing leaf springs, and that they have to be properly secured from the front to the back. The air shock cannot be leaking because it's holding fluid, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, no missing parts, and has to be properly secured at the top and at the bottom. Then we go to the brake system. We have a brake chamber, cannot be missing any parts. Keyword, it's holding air, so it cannot be leaking. It can't be cracked, bent, or damaged, and has to be properly secured. The air hoses have to be properly coupled, secured, not leaking. The hoses themselves cannot be cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and they have to be properly secured. On the back side of this brake chamber, we have a slack adjuster, made of metal, cannot have no missing parts, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, has to be properly secured. When the brakes are set, the slack adjuster sits at about a 90-degree angle. When the brakes are released, you should not be able to pull out that push rod no more than 1 inch. Okay, now we're going to go to the back side of this tire and rim. We have a brake drum, which is made in metal, so it cannot be, the rim cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, and that the rim has to be properly secured. The brake lining cannot be worn dangerously thin or have any signs of contaminants such as grease or oil. Then we go back to the tire itself. This is the front steer axle. We cannot have no less than 4/32 tread depth. The tire itself, we're looking for damage, so we go to the ABC method: no abrasions, no bulging, and no cuts. Then you have to go to the proper inflation of air pressure of the tire, checking it with the tire gauge. Then you're going to check out the valve stem. The valve stem, making sure it's present, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured. Then we're going to go to the rim, made of metal, making sure that the rim is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and there's no re-welds, and that the rim is properly secured. Checking out all the lug nuts, making sure all the lug nuts are present, they are tight, no trails of rust, and no shiny exposed threads. Checking out the hub seal, making sure it's at its adequate full level, it's holding fluid so it cannot be leaking, and it has to be properly secured. Now we're going to move over to the other side. Going over to the other side, we have the reservoir that holds your coolant fluid for the radiator system. It has an eyeglass. Give it a little shake, make sure it's at its full mark. Make sure that it isn't leaking, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, it's properly secured. The cap is present and the cap is secured. This is the air compressor back here. It's holding air, so we're making sure that that air compressor is not leaking and it's not missing any parts and it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that that air compressor is properly secured. Then you have the air hoses, making sure that they are properly coupled and secured and not leaking. The hoses themselves are not cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and that the hoses are properly secured. Going to the steering column, we have the steering shaft, making sure it's not cracked, bent, or shifted, or damaged, and no missing parts, and that the steering shaft is properly secured from the top to the bottom. Then we have the power steering reservoir, making sure that it is full, not leaking, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured. Power steering gearbox, holding fluid, making sure it's not leaking, it's not missing any parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. Checking out the power steering hoses, making sure that they are properly coupled, secured, and not leaking. Checking out the hoses, making sure the hoses are not cracked, frayed, worn, dry rotted, or leaking, and that the hoses are properly secured. Then we have a pitman arm, making sure that the pitman arm is not missing any parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, properly secured at the top and at the bottom. And at the bottom we have a castle nut, making sure the castle nut is present and properly secured. The cotter key is present and properly secured. On the back side of that pitman arm, we have a drag link, making sure that it's not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and that it is properly secured from the front to the back. On the back side of that drag link, we have an upper control arm, making sure that control arm is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured. Castle nut is present and properly secured. Cotter key is present and properly secured. Then you look a little bit below that upper control arm, we have a lower control arm made of metal, making sure it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. The castle nut is present and properly secured. The cotter key is present and properly secured. Off of that lower control arm, we have a tie rod that moves the left left axle and the right axle from left to right for your steering. So made of metal, making sure it's not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and it is properly secured from one side of the axle to the other side of the axle. Then we're going to check out the framing over here, making sure that the framing is not missing any parts, such as all your bolts are present and tight. The frame itself is not cracked, bent, shifted, no shiny exposed metal, and it is properly secured. Same as the other side. On all your hoses, you're checking all your hoses, making sure they are all properly coupled, secured, not leaking. The hoses are not cracked, worn, dry rotted, or leaking, and that all hoses are properly secured. Going to the front suspension of the driver's side axle, we're going to look at the front mount, the center U-bolt mount, the rear mount, made of metal, making sure that it isn't cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured at the top and at the bottom. The center U-bolt mount, made of metal, not missing any parts, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. The rear mount, made of metal, making sure it's not missing any parts, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured at the top and at the bottom. Looking at your leaf springs, making sure your leaf springs are not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and there's no missing leaf springs, and they are properly secured from the front mount all the way back to the back mount. Then you're looking at your air shock. It's holding fluid, so it cannot be leaking, so gotta make sure that that shock is not leaking, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, no missing parts, and it's properly secured at the top and at the bottom. Then we're going to go back to the brake system on this driver's side, going back to the brake chamber, making sure the brake chamber has no missing parts. It's holding air, so it cannot be leaking, so it can't be cracked, bent, or damaged. It has to be properly secured. The air hoses that come off that brake chamber have to be properly coupled, secured, not leaking. The hoses themselves cannot be cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and they have to be properly secured. On the back side of that brake chamber, we have a slack adjuster made of metal. It cannot have no missing parts. It can't be cracked, bent, or damaged. It has to be properly secured. When the brakes are set, it sets at about a 90-degree angle. When the brakes are released, you should not be able to pull out that push rod no more than 1 inch. On the back side of this tire and rim, we have a brake drum made of metal, making sure it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that the brake drum is properly secured. On the inside of that brake drum, we have brake linings, making sure them brake linings are not worn dangerously thin and no signs of contaminants such as grease or oil. Going to the tire itself now, this is still part of the front steer axle, so the tread depth remains the same, which is no less than 4/32 tread depth. Then we go back to the ABC method of no abrasions, no bulging, and no cuts. Then we check the proper inflation of air pressure of the tire with a tire gauge, making sure that it has proper tire pressure. Then we're going to check the valve stem out, making sure that the valve stem is present, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured. Checking out the rim, making sure the rim, it's made of metal, so it can't be cracked, bent, or damaged, and it cannot have any re-welds, and it has to be properly secured. Checking out all our lug nuts, making sure all the lug nuts are present, they are tight, no trails of rust, and no shiny exposed threads. Checking out the hub seal, making sure the hub seal has adequate fluid level, it is not leaking, and that hub seal is properly secured. Going over to your steps, making sure the steps are present, they're made of metal, they can't be not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they have to be properly secured. Checking out your door, making sure your door opens and closes. Checking the door sill, making sure that the door sill is present and it is not damaged and that it is properly secured. Checking out your door hinges, making sure there's no missing parts on your door hinges. They are not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured. Then you're going to check out your top mount and bottom mount of the frame of your mirrors, making sure there's no missing parts on that top mount or that bottom mount, making sure they're not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured. Then you're going to check out the framing of the mirror itself, making sure there's no missing parts and the frame is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured. The mirror itself, you're going to make sure that the mirror is cleaned and it's not cracked and it's not damaged. The fuel tank, checking out these fuel straps that secure the fuel tank. Make sure they're present, they're not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured. The most important thing you're going to be checking on this fuel tank, that it is not leaking. Okay? Then you're going to check the fuel cap. Make sure the fuel cap is present, it is tight, and that it is not leaking. Then back in here, you're going to check out your fuel lines. Make sure they're properly coupled, secured, not leaking. The fuel lines themselves are not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are not leaking, and they are properly secured. Okay, going back to the catwalk. Now we have the catwalk steps. Making sure there's no missing parts, they're not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured to the frame. Going to the catwalk, making sure that the catwalk is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured from one side of the frame to the other side of the frame, and that it is free of all foreign objects or any debris. Any objects could be your electrical cable or your air hoses. The catwalk has to totally be free of any debris. Then we have a dry shaft in here.
Where is it?
The dry shaft right here.
It's the drive shaft.
Made of metal, cannot be cracked, bent, or shifted or damaged, cannot have any missing parts, has to be properly secured from the front to the back. Then checking out your framing, making sure your framing is not have any missing parts, such as your bolts, making sure they're all present, secured. The frame itself is not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and no exposed shiny metal. Then your I-beams, checking out all your I-beams, making sure there's no missing parts. There again, it's made of metal, can't be cracked, bent, or damaged. It has to be properly secured from one side of the frame to the other side of the frame. Checking out your exhaust system, making sure there's no missing parts. It cannot be leaking, and that it has to be properly secured at the top and at the bottom. And it cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged. Key word on that exhaust system is it cannot be leaking. All right. Now we're going to our electrical connectors. This is what supplies lights from the tractor to the trailer, so you have lights on your trailer for night driving. So you're going to look at this electrical outlet, making sure there's no missing parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured. Then you're going to look at your electrical connector, making sure that it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, it's properly seated and secured into the electrical outlet. The electrical cable itself, you're going to be making sure it's not cracked or damaged and no exposed wiring, and that it is properly secured. On the front header of this trailer, you have electrical outlet, making sure there's no missing parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that the electrical outlet is properly secured. The electrical connector, making sure it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, no missing parts, and it's properly seated and secured into the electrical outlet. The air hoses, making sure the air hoses coming off the tractor are properly coupled and secured and not leaking. The air hoses themselves are not cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and that they are properly secured. Going back to the front header of the trailer where the air hose is hooked up, these are glad hands, making sure that they are properly coupled and secured and not leaking. The glad hands themselves are not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured to the air hoses themselves. How they hook up to these couplings here, and you also want to check out your seal, making sure your seal is not damaged and it's properly secured. How you hook it up into these couplings, 90-degree angle. Get the seal centered on the seals at a 90-degree angle, and they just hook right in there. Never handle these down here when you're hooking them up. Always grab them up in here. No, you do not. On your test, all you have to do is point and explain. Okay. You do not have to do nothing. I'll just show you that so when you're on your own, you know what you got to do. Gotcha. Okay. So on the front header, we're making sure that the front header is not bulged, it's not cracked, and there's no holes in the front header. Checking out the framing around that front header, making sure it has no missing parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. Then you would have your splash guards, which is missing. You would make sure your splash guards are present and that they are not, there's no missing parts and they are not worn or damaged and they are properly secured. Then going to the front suspension of your drive axles. These are called drive axles on the back of your tractor. So we're looking at the front hanger mount, a center U-bolt mount, and a rear mount. The front hanger mount, made of metal, cannot have any missing parts, can't be cracked, bent, or damaged, and has to be properly secured at the top and at the bottom. The center U-bolt mount, made of metal, cannot have any missing parts, cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged, and has to be properly secured.
Now the center U-bolt mount is where?
Right here. Right in the middle, just like on that, right here. This is the center U-bolt mount. In the back, you have a rear mount, making sure that it has no missing parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured at the top and at the bottom. Also, you have an airbag, making sure that the airbag is present, it's not cracked, worn, or dry rotted, it's not leaking, and it's also properly secured at the top and at the bottom. You have a air shock, making sure there's no missing parts, it's holding fluid so it cannot be leaking, so make sure it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured at the top and at the bottom. The leaf springs themselves, making sure that the leaf springs are present, they're not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and there's no missing leaf springs, and they are properly secured from the front mount all the way back to the back mount. And there's no missing leaf springs. Underneath that leaf spring, you have a torque arm, making sure that the torque arm is present, it's not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and it is properly secured from the front to the back. Going to the brake system, you have a brake chamber, making sure it has no missing parts, it's not leaking because it's holding air, and that it is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured. Checking the air hoses, making sure they're properly coupled, secured, not leaking. The hoses themselves are not cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and they are properly secured. On the back side of that brake chamber, you have a slack adjuster, making sure that there's no missing parts, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. When the brakes are set, it sets at about a 90-degree angle. When the brakes are released, you should not be able to pull out that push rod no more than 1 inch. On the back side of this tire and rim and spacer, you have a brake drum made of metal, making sure that the brake drum is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that the brake drum is properly secured. On the inside of that brake drum, you have brake linings, making sure they are not worn dangerously thin and there's no signs of contaminants such as grease or oil. Now, going to the drive axle itself, the tires. What keeps these tires centered away, spaced away from each other so they are not rubbing on each other and they stay center as you drive down the road, this is called a bud spacer. It has to be free of all debris. It cannot be cracked, bent, or shifted, or damaged, and it has to be properly centered and secured. The drive axle tires themselves, the tread depth would be no less than 2/32 tread depth on the drive axles. Then you go back to the tire itself as far as it being worn. You go to the ABC method, no abrasions, no bulging, no cuts. And then you go to the inflation of the tire pressure of the tire, checking it with the tire gauge. Then you check out the valve stem, making sure that the valve stem is it's present, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured. Checking out the rim, making sure that the rim is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and no re-welds, and it is properly secured. Checking out all your lug nuts, making sure your lug nuts are present, they are tight, no trails of rust, and no shiny exposed threads. Checking out your hub seal, making sure it's at its adequate full level and that it is not leaking. All lug nuts are present, they are tight, no trails of rust, and no shiny exposed threads. So, all the mechanical mechanisms that we discussed on that front drive axle are the exact same as this rear axle, so we're just going to talk about what they actually were. So we talked about a front mount hanger, we talked about a center U-bolt mount, we talked about a rear mount, we talked about an airbag, we talked about an air shock, we talked about the leaf springs themselves, we talked about the torque arm. Then we went to the brake system. We talked about a brake chamber. We talked about the brake air hoses off of the brake chamber. We talked about the slack adjuster. We talked about the brake drum. We talked about the brake linings of the inside the drum. Then we went to the spacer of these two drive axle tires, which was the bud spacer. Then we talked about the tread depth of them drive axles. We talked about the tire itself being worn as far as no abrasions, no bulging, no cuts. We talked about the proper air pressure of inflation of that tire. We talked about the valve stem. We talked about all them lug nuts. We talked about the rim, and we had mentioned the hub seal about it not being leaking and that it is at its full level. And we talked about the lug nuts. Now we're going to talk about the fifth wheel. The sliding fifth wheel skid plate, which is right here. This is not a sliding fifth wheel skid plate. If it were, the framing of it would be a little bit different design. You would say rectangular slots in the frame all the way down, and you would see locking pins where this skid plate would adjust and slide forward or backwards. This is a stationary skid plate. This fifth wheel does not slide forward or backwards. So what we're looking for right now, we're looking at the framing of this skid plate. We're checking out for missing parts, making sure all the bolts are present and they are tight. The frame itself is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured to the frame. The fifth wheel release arm, making sure that it is locked in the lock position. The safety latch is present and locked in the lock position. When this fifth wheel release arm is locked in the lock position, there will be locking jaws that lock over the kingpin. The kingpin is attached to this apron, dead center on this apron. So the kingpin cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged and has to be properly secured. The apron itself cannot be cracked, bent, or damaged and has to be properly secured from one side of the trailer to the other side of the trailer. Most important, there cannot be a gap between this platform and the apron itself. No gap. So, and it has to be properly centered. So when you make wide turns, that the framing of the tractor doesn't come in contact with that landing gear. Yeah, you see that bar that goes across? There's a bar that goes across inside there. Yeah. That bar is over the kingpin. Yeah. That's when that release arm is locked in position. When you back the tractor into that kingpin, that platform slides in and locks in, and then that release arm locks in position. Soon as that happens, that locking jaw locks over that kingpin.
Yep, that's the locking jaw.
That's the locking jaw that goes across. Yep. All right, now you're going to check out your splash guards here, making sure that the splash guards are present, they are not missing any parts, and they are not damaged, and they are properly secured. Going to your landing gear, making sure that the landing gear is fully raised, the foot pads are present, they're not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured. Handle to raise these legs up or down, making sure that the handle is present, it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured. The reason for the legs have to be fully raised in the up position, because when you go around turns and you hit a curb, you can knock off these foot pads. You knock off them foot pads, you can't land this trailer at a dock when you go to drop off your load. So checking out the framing of this, making sure it has no missing parts and that it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and there's no broken welds, and it's properly secured from one side of the trailer to the other side of the trailer. As you go down the trailer itself, you're going to see all these cross members. They're all made of metal, so you want to make sure they are not cracked, bent, or damaged, and they are properly secured from one side of the trailer to the other side of the trailer. As you go down and check all these cross members, you're going to be checking out your flooring, making sure that the flooring is properly secured to the cross members and that there's no holes in your flooring. Then we're going to check out the sidewalls of the trailer itself, making sure that the sidewalls are not bulged, they're not cracked, and there's no holes in the sidewalls. Then you're going to check out the framing all the way around these sidewalls of your trailer, making sure that the framing has no missing parts. The frame itself around the walls of the trailer are not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it is properly secured all the way around the trailer. Then you have reflector tape along the side walls of this trailer, making sure your reflector tape is present, it's not worn or damaged, and that it is properly secured to the side walls of your trailer all the way down. These are your trailer axles. In the trucking world, they call these your sliding tandem axles. So what you would be looking for here, you have a sliding tandem rail, making sure that the sliding tandem rail is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is and there's no broken welds, and it's properly secured. You have a tandem release arm, making sure that it is locked in the lock position and that these pins are locked in the lock position. If this tandem release arm is not locked in the lock positions, these locking pins will be inside them slots. If they are not out of them slots and locked into place, what happens when you drive off, this trailer's not coming with you, all right? So the tandem release arm has to be locked in position, and these locking pins have to also be locked in the lock position. Now that's all you have to know about this tandem release arm, the locking pins, and the tandem sliding rail here, okay? When this is released and them locking pins are disengaged, that allows you to move these tandem axles either forward or back. What happens, the axles do not move. You'll have the trailer brake set and the trailer slides either forward or backwards. The axles actually stay in place. They do not move. The trailer slides on this frame, either forward or backwards, and that's to accommodate and adjust your weight on your axles. You can't have more than 34,000 pounds on your drive axles, and you can't have more than 34,000 pounds on your trailer axles, which are your tandem axles. So now we're going to go to the suspension of these trailer axles. They're not air driven, so we don't have an airbag and we don't have an air shock. What we have is a front mount, a center U-bolt mount, and we have a rear mount made of metal, making sure there's no missing parts, not cracked, bent, or damaged, properly secured at the top and at the bottom. The center U-bolt mount made of metal, not missing any parts, not cracked, bent, or damaged, properly secured. And the rear mount, not missing any parts, not cracked, bent, or damaged, properly secured at the top and at the bottom. Then you have the leaf springs, making sure that they are not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged. There's no missing leaf springs, and they are properly secured from the front to the back. Underneath that leaf spring, you have a torque arm made of metal, making sure it's not cracked, bent, shifted, or damaged, and it is properly secured from the front to the back. Then we go to the brake system of this trailer axle. Same as the drive axles, you have a brake chamber, making sure there's no missing parts. It's holding air so it cannot be leaking. can't be cracked, bent, or damaged, properly secured. You go to the ear hoses coming off that brake chamber, making sure they are properly coupled, secured, and not leaking. You're checking the hoses themselves, making sure they are not cracked, frayed, dry rotted, or leaking, and that the hoses are properly secured. On the back side of this trailer axle, you have a brake drum made of metal, making sure it's not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. On the inside of that brake drum, you have brake linings, making sure they are not worn, dangerously thin, and no signs of contaminants such as grease or oil. So on your drive axles, we had a bud spacer. On these trailer axles, we just have a spacer. It's this rippled metal spacer. Same thing, has to be free of all debris. It's made of metal, so it can't be cracked, bent, or damaged, and it has to be properly centered and secured. Then we're going to talk about the tires themselves. Same as the drive axles, the tread depth cannot be no less than 2/32 on your tread depth. Then we're going to talk about the tire itself as far as it being worn. So we're going to go back to the ABC method. No abrasions, no bulging, no cuts. Then we're going to check the proper inflation of the tire as far as the air pressure is concerned. We're going to check that with the tire gauge. Then we're going to check the valve stem, making sure that the valve stem is present, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured. We're going to check out the rim itself, making sure it's not cracked, bent, or shifted, or damaged, and no re-welds, and it is properly secured. Checking out all your lug nuts, making sure all your lug nuts are present, they are tight, no trails of rust, and no shiny exposed threads. Checking out your hub seal, making sure it's at its adequate full level and that it is not leaking. All bolts are present and they are properly secured. So all the mechanical mechanisms that we talked about on this front tandem axle or front trailer axle is the same as the rear trailer axle or tandem axle. So we're going to just mention them all again to refresh in your mind of what we discussed. So what we discussed, we talked about the tandem release arm, we talked about the tandem sliding rail frame, we talked about the locking pins when the release arm is locked in the lock position. We talked about the front mount. We talked about a center U-bolt mount. We talked about a rear mount. We talked about the leaf springs themselves. We talked about a torque arm. Then we talked about the brake system, the brake chamber. We talked about the air hoses on the back side of that brake chamber. We didn't talk about a slack adjuster. That's why it's important to have that cheat sheet to go back and revert to it so you don't lose credit for it. So on the back side of that brake chamber, you have a slack adjuster made of metal, so it can't have no missing parts. It can't be cracked, bent, or damaged. It has to be properly secured. When the brakes are set, it sits at a 90-degree angle. When the brakes are released, you should not be able to pull out that push rod no more than 1 inch. And then we talked about a brake drum. We talked about the brake linings. We talked about the spacer that centers the tires apart from each other so they don't rub against each other when you're traveling down the road. We talked about the tread depth of the tires. We talked about the tires being worn, about no abrasions, no bulging, no cuts. We talked about the proper inflation of the tire. We talked about the valve stem. We talked about the rim. We talked about all the lug nuts, and we talked about the hub seal. Moving on to the doors themselves, we're going to check out our door ties, making sure our door ties are present. They're not cracked or damaged, and they are properly secured. Why that's important: without these door ties, you can't open up your door. The doors themselves, making sure they are not bulged, not cracked, and there's no holes in your doors. You're going to check all your reflector tape, making sure all your reflector tape is present and it is not cracked or worn or damaged, and it is properly secured. Then you're going to have reflector tape along your bumper and making sure that it is not damaged and it is present and it's properly secured. Checking out all your tail lights, making sure all your tail lights are clean and that they are not cracked or damaged and that they are properly secured. So coming on this side of the trailer, since we already talked about the axles and all the mechanical mechanisms to the axles, we're not going to discuss that, same as the drive axles, but we are going to make sure that the mud flap is present on this side and make sure it has no missing parts and that the splash guard is properly secured. You are going to check your sidewalls on this side of the trailer though, making sure that the sidewalls are not bulged, not cracked, and there's no holes. Then you're going to check out all the framing all the way around the sidewalls of this side of the trailer, making sure there's no missing parts and that the frame itself is not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that it is properly secured all the way around the sidewall of the trailer. And you're also going to be checking your door tie, making sure that the door tie is present, not cracked, bent, or damaged, and it's properly secured. You're going to check all your reflector tape on this side of the trailer, making sure all your reflector tape is present, it's not worn or damaged, and it is properly secured. Then as you go up the trailer, we already talked about our axles, tires, but we are going to discuss the fuel tank on this passenger side and the steps, making sure that the steps are present, they're not cracked, bent, or damaged, they are properly secured. We're going to check out the fuel tank itself. Most important thing about that fuel tank, we're going to make sure that fuel tank's not leaking. The band straps that secure the tank to the vehicle, making sure they are present, they're not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that they are properly secured. The fuel cap itself, making sure the fuel cap is present, tight, and properly secured and not leaking. Okay? Now, that's the pre-trip inspection on the outside of the vehicle. Now we'll get ready to do an in-cab. In-cab inspection. Seat belt. Making sure that the seat belt is not worn, torn, or damaged and that it is properly secured. Then you're going to make sure that the seat belt actually properly latches and it properly unlatches. Okay? After you check the seat belt out, you're going to talk about the 3 emergency equipment devices that you need on hand at all times, which is 3 electrical fuses or circuit breakers. That's one device. The second device is a manufacturer fully rated, charged, properly secured fire extinguisher. That's 2. The third one is 3 reflector triangles. Okay? So after that, your doors are going to be shut. You're going to check out them mirrors. You're going to make sure that them mirrors are clean, not cracked, not damaged, and that they are adjusted to you as the driver. That's very important. You mentioned that they are adjusted to you as the driver. So that would be your driver's side mirror and your passenger side mirror. That has to be adjusted to you as the driver. Then you can talk, and that the mirrors have to be clean. Very key word. That all lights and mirrors have to be clean. So when you talk about this windshield, have to check out the windshield, making sure there's no obstructions, no obstructed view. The windshield cannot be cracked or damaged. It has to be clean, and that the sill around the window has to be present, cannot be damaged. The windshield itself has to be properly secured. Okay, now we're going to safe start the vehicle. How do we safe start the vehicle? This is how we safe start the vehicle. We depress the clutch, make sure it's in neutral.
Turn it to the on position.
We're going to turn the key to the on position. You're going to have lights that go on over here. Your gauges, your needles on your gauges are going to rise all the way over. Then they're going to come all the way back and they're going to start rising up. At that time, after that takes place and the lights go off, you are ready to safe start your vehicle. Release the clutch very slowly. You may have an ABS signal light that comes on. let the examiner know that the ABS signal light is working and that it will go off after a few seconds of the vehicle running. Then you're going to have a low air pressure warning alarm signal that will be beeping, and it will go off after the air pressure rises above 60 pounds per square inch. Make sure you mention that to the examiner about the low air pressure warning alarm signal, that buzzer will stay going off until the air pressure rises above 60 pounds of pressure, and that the air pressure should rise up to about 120, and then it'll cut out. Okay, now at this time we have four indicator signal lights. Okay, we have our four ways. You're going to point to them to let them know that the four-way indicator signals are working. Then you have a left turn signal indicator working. Then you're going to have a right turn signal indicator that is working. And then you're going to turn on your high beams for your lights, which is going to be a blue light in here. And you make sure that your high beam indicator light signal is working. So there's four of them. You have your four ways, you have your left turn signal, your right turn signal, and you have your high beams. At that point, we're going to talk about our city horn and our emergency horn. So you're going to beep the city horn, make sure the city horn's working, then you're going to check the emergency horn. Okay? Now we're going to check our gauges. We have a water temperature gauge. Make sure that the water temperature gauge is working and rising to proper operating water temperature. Oil pressure gauge, same thing. Making sure that it is working and that it is rising to proper operating oil pressure. Then you got your voltage gauge, making sure that it is working and rising to proper operating alternating charge. Okay? Then we're going to check out our heating system and turn on the defrosters and check the blower motor. Make sure we have defrosters. And you're going to check this on high, on low, medium, and high. Make sure that your heating system is working on all levels. After you check your heating system, you're going to talk about your windshield wiper blades. You're going to talk about the windshield wiper arms first, making sure that they are not cracked, bent, or damaged, and that they are properly secured. You're going to check out the windshield washer blades, making sure they are not cracked, frayed, dry rotted, and that they are properly secured to the windshield wiper arm. Then you're going to check your windshield wipers to make sure they are working on low, medium, and high. After you make sure that they are working on low, medium, and high, you're going to check your windshield washer fluid. You're going to hit the switch and make sure your windshield washer fluid is working. Okay, so now we're going to check our brake system. Okay, how do we check our brake system? We're going to check the parking brake to see if it holds the vehicle. Well, how are we going to do that? We're going to depress the clutch. We're going to put the vehicle in first gear. We're going to release the trailer brake, which is your red valve, and we're going to keep the parking brake set. Now we're in first gear, our foot's on the clutch. We're going to release the clutch and see if it holds the vehicle. We're checking the parking brake right now. Okay, boom. Let's say it held the vehicle. We put it back in neutral. Set the brakes again. Now we're going to check the trailer brakes to see if the trailer brakes hold. How are we going to do that? The exact same way. Depress the clutch, put the gear shifter back in first. Instead of releasing the trailer brake this time, since we're checking the trailer brake, we're going to release the parking brake, which is the yellow valve. Okay, now we're going to let up on the clutch and see if the trailer brakes hold. Boom, they just held. You see that? Now we're going to put it back in neutral, set the brakes again. Now we're going to check we're going to check the service brake to see if the service brake stops the vehicle, which is your brake itself. You call that the service brake. You're going to put your foot on the service brake, which is your brake pedal, and you're going to see if it stops the vehicle. So this is how you check your service brake. To press the clutch, put it back in first, release both belts. When you release both belts, we're going to move the vehicle about 5 feet, and we're going to put our foot on the service brake to see if it stops the vehicle. Let's check it out, see what happens. Boom. It stopped the vehicle. At that time, we're going to leave the trailer brake and the parking brake released. Now we're going to check our loss of air pressure gauges. We're going to check the air pressure alarm, the alarm signal to make sure that that works. And then we're going to see if both of these valves pop out once we release more air out of the system. So on this test, that's why we leave the trailer brake and the parking brake released. We don't set them again. Truck's in neutral. We're going to shut the vehicle off. On this particular low air pressure check, brake check, we're going to leave the key in the on position. If right now we weren't on level ground and the truck started rolling, to press the clutch and put the vehicle back in first gear. And then release the clutch slowly. Okay. So what we're going to do, the first test to check the air brake system, is you're going to apply your foot on the service brake and hold it for 1 minute. In that 1 minute's time, you should not lose more than 4 pounds of pressure in that 1 minute's time. So, you're going to look at the examiner and say, I'm going to simulate that the 1 minute has gone by and we did not lose more than 4 pounds of pressure in that 1 minute. He'll say, carry on. Now you're going to release air out of the brake system. And we're going to check for the low air pressure warning alarm signal, which should go off once we release the air and the air pressure goes down to about 60 pounds per square inch. So let's start pumping the service brake and releasing air in the system. Boom, at 60 psi, the low warning alarm system has come on. Now we're going to pump it, we're going to release more air down to about 40 or 20 to see if our parking valves pop out. See if the trailer valve pops out and the parking brake pops out. And that should happen about 40 or 20. Boom, they just popped out. Right around 40 or 20 psi's, both valves will pop out. Then you shut the vehicle back off, depress the clutch, put it back to neutral, turn the key in the on position. We're going to safe start the vehicle again. Now our in-cab inspection is done. Now we're going to do a light inspection. We're going to check our lights. Okay, now we're going to safe start the vehicle. Keep the vehicle in neutral. Now we're going to go back outside the vehicle and check all our lights. So we're going to turn the lights on from the inside right here. Now we're going to go outside and check our light system. Remember, getting out of the vehicle, we use 3 points of contact for safety. Holding on to the handrail here, stepping down each step backwards, one at a time. 3 points of contact, leaving the vehicle. Over the 2 key rooms of the lights, making sure that they are working and that the lights are clean. They are not cracked and bent and they're properly secure. These are the low beam lights. They're working. So at this time, you will go back in and hit the high beam switch and come back out and check that your high beams are working. Once you check That's a marker light. These are your only tail lights. This is just a marker ABS light that's not going off. Then you walk around the vehicle, check your marker light here. You already checked your tractor. Check your clearance light up there. Check your marker light. Check all this. Now we're gonna check the four-ways. Walk all the way around the vehicle and check the trailer's side marker four-way. Make sure they are working. Never forget about your tractor. Left turn signal is working on the back side of your trailer. Then you go back around and you turn on your right turn signal. You're going to check your right turn signal now. You walk around on your right. Never had it. Didn't find any paperwork in none of our students. Didn't find shit in nobody. Not you couldn't find no paperwork on the yard students. I mean on the road ones. Okay, now we check the right turn signal. Make sure that it's working. Make sure that it's working. Make sure that it's working. Check the tractor right turn signal. Make sure that it's working. The trailer marker turn signal working on the right side. Then I'll walk back here and check the back tail light. Make sure your right turn signal is working on the back of the trailer. Now at that time, you have checked all your lights except your brake lights. So now at this time, you will ask the examiner to assist you to stand behind your trailer on the left-hand side of your tractor. And when you put your foot on the service brake and hold it, he'll give you a thumbs up if you have brake lights on your trailer as well as your tractor. So if one of you would stand back there and I'll apply my foot on the service brake to see if we have brake lights. Then you want yeah. Even though they red. Hey, yeah. Let's turn them on. Going back to the back of the trailer. See? That's why you revert back to that cheat sheet. I want to clarify. Every trailer, you have to make sure them clearance lights up there, them clearance marker lights, clearance lights. I like to refer to them as clearance lights. Make sure that they are working also. Some trucks have them all the way across. The law is no less than 3. You have to have 3. So most trailers will only have 3, but the fancy trailers will have them all the way across. You'll see them all the way around the whole side of the trailer even.
Yeah. So we mentioned the ABS light?
The ABS light is actually not working on this particular truck, but when you get on your own, you will have a ABS light that will be working on your trailer.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that pretty much sums up the vehicle inspection report, which was the pre-trip of the start of your day. Before you start your work day, you will do a thorough pre-trip of your vehicle inside and out. That about cuts it from U.S. Truck Driving Training School, Sterling Heights, Michigan. Hoorah!
É isso aí, pessoal. See ya. See you guys.